Yes, good old TJ.
Konnichiwa, Emilias Descent. Back with another video. Today, guys, we are doing another ANINEWS video. This video, it is called "What Exactly Happened to Emilia Subaru's Hell's Loop ReZero Season 2 Episode 11 cut content." So, if you guys have never seen this ReZero anime, I think it's in this it's in the second season. It's like about this guy named Subaru that actually got transferred to this world, and he's literally every single time he dies, he gets reborn, and it's like a checkpoint. It's like a video game basically. It's like he dies, but it's like a certain checkpoint, then it like sits him back to a certain point. Like after he dies, like he gets sent back to a certain point, and he just keeps reliving through it. Like he knows he got killed, and he knows like what he experienced, but the fact that he keeps dying and keep being in the loop, henceforth this H loop that it says in the title of this video. But yeah, so that's really like the gist. Like the main thing about it is like Subaru's our protagonist, but like it's a witch or something like that. It's like put a spell on him to where like I think that's what it is. Like when he gets killed, he gets revived back like some days like earlier or something like that. But yeah, this video is probably gonna get a little graphic. I ain't gonna lie, because this anime is like real graphic. But yeah, guys. So without further ado, in this 25 minutes, so yeah, buckle yourselves in, get yourselves some snacks and everything like that, and let's get right into it. So
little by little, everything is finally starting to come together. But sometimes it feels like with every answer we get, two more questions pop up. One of which I'm sure you have is what exactly happened to Emilia.
Yeah.
Well, the novels actually gave us quite a detailed look into her descent into madness, something that'll be covered more towards the middle of the video. But what's arguably more important to explain is the whole encounter with Beatrice, especially the parts regarding why she refused his help. Then towards the end, you'll get to see why it was that this loop was the one Subaru considered to be the closest to hell. A couple of cutscenes that I definitely recommend sticking around for. So let's go through all this and more as we begin our longest cut content ever. But first, today's video is sponsored by Guardian Tales, which is honestly one of the most entertaining mobile games that I've played in a while. It's a classic pixel-styled action-adventure RPG, but what makes this game so fun to play is the way that the combat and progression is handled. The simple game controls of a 4-directional D-pad plus buttons for attack, interact, and run make it very easy to pick up. Then the maps you play through and the equipment and characters you pick up along the way ensure that the game is constantly fresh. I really like that the story mode is filled with various puzzles, hidden secrets, and battles of all sizes, all of which can be tackled with any of the over 50 in-game characters. Yes, they can be acquired via the in-game loot box summons, but some of them and the over 200 unique pieces of equipment can also be obtained throughout the story. You just have to find them. And even if this immersive single-player story isn't quite your thing, there's plenty of other game modes too, like 4-player co-op raids, 1v1 PvP, or even towers and dungeons. So if you're looking for a new free-to-play mobile RPG that excels in both gameplay and story, then I highly recommend using the link in the description to download Guardian Tales today.
Use money.
Now, let's get back to the video. Episode 36, The Taste of Death, covering chapters 3 to 4 of volume 12 of the light novel. When Subaru first entered the library, there was one peculiar thing that he finally noticed about Beatrice's position. Despite there being various desks and tables scattered throughout the room, Subaru found that Beatrice was always seated on this one single stool. She was always there, sitting at the center of the room right in front of the door, as if always ready to receive a guest. It was a hint towards Beatrice's truth that had been in front of us the entire time, a truth that Subaru was now trying to piece together. But that objective quickly got pushed to the side when Subaru became angered by the false image of the girl he thought he knew. I mean, Beatrice was always so full of confidence. She was always this person he could look up to as a pillar of strength, someone he could rely on whenever he needed it most. Yet here she was looking the complete opposite, helpless and frail and weak. This wasn't the Beatrice that Subaru came to know. It made him feel as if the person he became so close with was nothing but a facade, as if he'd never actually really met the real Beatrice. It was this lingering doubt that made Subaru feel so much anger. But he wasn't angry at Beatrice for having led him astray. His anger was directed towards the book that she was supposedly bound by. so he snatched it away from her. Perhaps if he read some of what was on the inside, he could discover a slight sense of what Beatrice truly thought. More than anything, Subaru just wanted to understand her. But as we saw, the book was empty. This fact contradicted everything that Subaru was initially led to believe. I mean, it was only a couple loops ago that Beatrice stated with such conviction that her past actions were only because of the book's guidance. Clearly that wasn't the case anymore. This new information of the book having been blank for years now implied that when Beatrice had helped him in the past, it was out of her own free will. An implication that renewed Subaru's hope in this spirit. In fact, this was the most hope that Subaru had felt in a while. Mainly because this entire time he'd been pushing forward under the assumption that his 2 months getting to know Beatrice was fake. His previous encounter with her had left him with a gut-wrenching sense of agony and disbelief. But now that that was proven to no longer be the case, it was as if a very heavy burden had now been lifted off his chest. Beatrice then went on to talk a little bit more about her contract, and it was during this explanation that a significant line was omitted from the anime. The actual reason behind why she was waiting for that person. We already know that her job was to protect the archive until that person appeared. But what she didn't say was that the knowledge within the archive was supposed to be passed on to that person as well. It's a line that indicates the purpose of that person was to inherit Echidna's knowledge. So this was a promise tied both to that person and the archive of the forbidden books, both of which kept Beatrice bound to her pact. Now, Subaru couldn't just up and tell her that he was that person. He wasn't even sure that Roswaal was telling him the truth about it. Not only that, but the current situation was also far too delicate.
That's why he kept
Subaru
saying,
simply wasn't sure what the right words were to say.
Wow.
There was no telling how Beatrice would act if she knew that he was that person, or if she would even believe him. So, he said nothing. Beatrice then continued to talk about how her past 400 years had been.
Wow.
At first, she actually didn't find the initial few decades to be all that bad. I mean, she was living with a person who stood in the exact same position that she did, one that revolved around following the text of the book. But eventually that first Mather's family member would die, beginning a cycle of replacement that Beatrice would have to watch for centuries. As one Roswaal died, the next would go on to inherit their ancestors' duty. Such was the way things were. This made time eventually become very stale. It was always the same thing over and over again. The only thing that kept Beatrice clinging to reality was the faith that that person would come. But when the book stopped showing her future and that person never walked through those doors, the only conclusion that Beatrice could come to was that there was no future for her. This was a mindset that was very reminiscent to a situation from not too long ago. You see, Subaru knew all too well the corner that people tend to drive themselves into whenever faced with what seems to be an insurmountable obstacle. He knew that the harder you try to overcome it by yourself, the farther into despair you go. So Subaru tried to give to Beatrice what Rem once gave to him. He wanted with all his soul to be able to drag her out of this pit of loneliness. But Subaru's words were far too shallow to even reach. I mean, referring to 400 years of isolation as something that can be solved by simply asking for help was neither the answer Beatrice was looking for nor the answer she needed. Subaru saying he'll save her meant absolutely nothing in comparison to the wounds that have built over the span of 4 centuries. This is because he wasn't the first person to enter the library bearing such ambitious words. Sure, some have come only in search of gaining the power of a great spirit, but others have also come offering the exact same thing that Subaru was offering right now. All of them, including Subaru, were far too naive to truly understand though. Half-hearted resolve like that wouldn't be enough to save her from her despair. If Subaru truly intended to save her, then he would have to place her above everyone else. But she knew as well as he did that his top spot was solely reserved for a single person. That's why no matter what he said, it would never be enough to save her. Instead, the only thing that he could do was kill her. Death was the only end that Beatrice saw fitting for a spirit that couldn't even keep their pact. Remember, spirits take pacts and contracts far more
So basically,
seriously
Beatrice
than
is in
humans
a
do.
never-ending
Sometimes
cycle.
it's quite
basically,
literally
of,
the
like,
only reason for their existence. So, for a
one
great
thing she
spirit
didn't
like
even do
Beatrice to
was
have accomplished nothing with no one for the past
Oh my
400
God,
years,
man.
well, that was essentially the same thing as her life having no purpose.
Oh my goodness.
To make things worse, this pact was actually the very first one that Beatrice was given. Her duty her entire life had been to protect the archives and wait for that person to show up. So this wasn't something she could easily cast
Yeah, he's
aside
making
like
you
how
cry,
Subaru
bro.
wanted her
Like,
to.
oh my
It's
god.
not that the person she contracted
Just
with would be
knowing
upset
what you
that
had
she
to go
didn't fulfill
through.
it to its end. It was more so because as a spirit she couldn't permit herself to live on with the failure of having never completed it. For Beatrice to abandon the very first pact that she ever made, well, that would essentially be the same thing as committing a very grave sin. One that goes against the very nature of a spirit's existence. So that's why she would rather die than commit that sin. There was also no point in living in loneliness for the rest of eternity either. And suicide wasn't even an option because that was considered to be the very same thing as violating the pact. It was an impermissible action for every spirit. So this left Subaru with only two options. He could either become that person for Beatrice and devote himself to her and her alone, or he could kill Beatrice with his own hands and end her suffering. There was no other way to save her. That's why when Elsa came into the room shortly after, Beatrice actually said that she didn't mind if she was the one to kill her. She knew that Subaru's mind was already focused on how he could get to the village. So that was pretty much Beatrice's way of saying forget about me and go take care of the others. But Subaru's determination to stay seemed to resonate with her. When she activated Shamak, as superior as Elsa's senses were, they weren't quite good enough to see past the smoke. Only those with an affinity for shadow magic were immune to its obstructive effects. As they ran to the village, Subaru could make out a black plume of smoke rising from its direction. Despite knowing exactly what tragedy awaited him under that plume, Subaru was still determined to see it for himself. His head filled with both anger and sadness as Beatrice tried to convey the futility of the situation. He no longer knew whether those emotions were meant to be directed towards Beatrice or towards himself. Was it Beatrice's insufficient will to live or his own constant failure that impacted him more? Subaru just couldn't tell anymore. In any case, when Subaru had learned the fate of the girls, his dramatic shift in confidence spurred a very harsh reaction out of Beatrice. I mean, it was only moments ago that Subaru was using such ambitious words to say that he'd save her. Yet here he was ready to give up on everything. To Beatrice, this was nothing short of pure arrogance, and his actions only showcased further betrayal to his own words. Beatrice could now confirm that Subaru did not in fact have what it took to save her. Because of this, her expression was now filled with utter disappointment.
But how would he even save her if
in
he's
the
just a
end, all
human?
she
You don't
could
got
say
no
was how
powers
her
or
own life
nothing.
was wasted on the likes of him. She did, however, step up to defend him under the context of protecting the archive in the process, leading us into the brief fight that we saw in the anime. When it was over, Subaru knew for a fact that Elsa had been killed by Beatrice's attack. Yet, somehow there she was standing completely unscathed. Not a single wound could be visibly seen on her body. The only thing that seemed to take damage was her clothing, which was now all ripped to shreds. This made Subaru ask if she was immortal. Of course, it was meant to be a joke, but Elsa actually responded as if he was serious. She said that referring to her as immortal would technically be incorrect, but she does live what she likes to call a filthier life than others, a blessing granted by a malicious soul. It wasn't as if she couldn't die, but her last line made it seem as if it was something that she's experienced before. At least that's how I personally interpreted it anyway.
Reincarnation?
Before they started to play with Subaru, Elsa first confirmed that all the targets were eliminated, finally giving us confirmation that their contract was only for one spirit and 2 maids. Now, there was actually a bit of significance behind Elsa's distaste in Subaru's eyes, a topic that was further discussed in the chibi short that accompanied this episode. So I'll link to that in the description so that you can see for yourself what it is that Elsa dislikes about Subaru the most. It also explains why she decided to slowly gouge out his eye. Unlike the little puncture that we saw in the anime, Elsa used her blade to completely skewer Subaru's left eye, dragging it out of its socket all while Subaru's right eye watched. He could see both the organ and its optic nerve be teared right out of his body, leaving him with nothing but pain and an empty cavity. The reason Elsa did this was partially because of the scorn that she felt towards Subaru. This was actually the first time that Subaru had ever seen such an emotion on Elsa's face. But it's not like this resentment was entirely unfounded. In fact, Subaru actually felt that that scorn was well deserved. He agreed with Elsa that Beatrice's sacrifice wasn't worth the person it was intended to save. After being teleported, Subaru could only lament over the atrocities he committed while in this world. He personally felt responsible for the death of every villager, maid, and spirit, each of which became a grave sin that etched itself into his soul. He hated himself for being so powerless and worthless to do
Hey
anything,
man, it's,
much to the point that he saw himself
like I
a
say,
criminal,
this anime is
a
good, man, but
self-proclaimed
it
apostle of
sucks,
atrocity.
man.
The
God.
only thing he could do to make up for
Goodness
such
gracious,
sins was to
bro.
give himself a death that rivaled them. He wouldn't permit himself to have a quicker, easy death this time. That was the only way that he could forgive himself. In any case, Subaru cast aside his regrets and despair so that he could push himself
What's when the
forward.
bunny's gonna kill
He
him?
wanted to learn what happened in Sanctuary before moving on to the next loop,
Oh god.
but he made sure not to
Oh,
forget
goodness.
that at
Oh,
the end he
goodness,
still
bro.
needed to atone. As he made his way out of the experimental facility, Subaru called for the closest clone to show herself. He knew that there was at least one of them assigned to watching the lab, so Subaru used her as his guide to get back to the settlement. It was after about an hour that Subaru finally arrived, but before heading into the tomb, he first found himself to be confronted by Garfield. Apparently one of his eyes had spotted him being guided by another, so Garfield came out to see if that was in fact the case. This brings us to an entire scene that didn't make it into the anime. You see, Garfield was very much furious about the current state of Sanctuary, and he thought that perhaps Subaru may have some answers. The only reason that Subaru was still alive right now was because Garfield's rage hadn't yet reached the tipping point, likely because the residents of Sanctuary were still deemed to be safe. This may not seem important right now, but most of them had gathered in the cathedral. Otto felt that it was a good idea to keep everyone together. That would have been the best way to take care of all the elderly. So Garfield accepted his recommendation. Now, the circumstances of this snow made for a very precarious situation, one that no one could really understand. But Garfield did have his suspicions. Suspicions that pertained to a much graver situation involving Emilia. Unlike in the anime, it was actually here in this moment that Subaru first finds out Emilia wasn't all there anymore. Before even seeing her in the tomb, Garfield straight up says that she went insane. She had learned the night before that Subaru had run away from Sanctuary, and this unexplained disappearance wasn't something that she took all too well. Of course, the letter should have prevented her from falling into despair, but Garfield knew nothing of any sort of letter being sent to her. Even without the letter though, that still shouldn't have been enough to make her go crazy. Clearly something or someone else was manipulating her emotions.
Right. That's what I
If
kinda
Subaru
think.
was able to figure out what it was and stop the snow in the process, then Garfield was happy to assist. That's why he allowed him to go into the tomb to see Emilia. He was sent in with the purpose of trying to bring her back to her senses. Garfield thought that that was the best approach to stopping the snow, and at this point it was the only thing that Subaru could do for Sanctuary. Now, the anime did a fantastic job depicting the scene with Emilia. There was, however, a key detail that needs to be mentioned. One that further
Oh,
explains
man,
just
she
how
was
exactly
crazy,
Emilia descended
man.
into madness. As Garfield had mentioned, Emilia had been in the tomb for well over a day. Not only that, but she was also found to be within the room of the trial. Since she was there overnight, that meant that the trial should have began as soon as she entered the room. It also meant that her mind wouldn't have been able to escape until the trial had ended. So the fact that she was awake right now meant only one thing. Emilia had challenged the trial and the trial had ended, the result of which was the person that we now see in front of him. A person whose eyes now showed nothing except for Subaru's reflection. It was a rather symbolic way of showing that Subaru was the only thing that this person had left. She was quite literally blinded by her love for him. That, however, is only a fraction of the answer. If we're to fully understand what happened to Emilia, then we also need to know what happened when she first found out that Subaru had left. At first, Emilia was scared. The pressure that arose from not being able to do anything right made her feel that Subaru would leave her forever. But then she realized that she could no longer be soft. She couldn't allow herself to cower in the corner while everyone else took care of her problems. No, not anymore. It made her look back and see how Subaru had always been taking care of her problems for her. It also made her remember the 3 words that he would always say. She never fully understood the true meaning behind those words up until now. Only after remembering how often Subaru had come to her rescue did those words finally start to resonate and leave a significant impact. An impact that only went to amplify the amount of worry that she felt for him. Because he was gone, a feeling of anxiety stacked and stacked to the point that it felt as if it would crush her. She felt that Subaru wouldn't ever want to return because she was so helpless. It pushed her into a
Emilia
corner
was
where the
going
only option
through
she
it,
had
man.
was to work even harder. Perhaps
Okay,
if she worked hard for
Subaru
his sake
love.
like how he always did for hers, then he might actually return. That being said, At this point, I don't think Emilia had fully lost her mind yet. No, what pushed her over the edge was the trial. But not a single trial like how you may have thought. The fact that she was in the tomb all night dictated otherwise. Instead, it was multiple trials. Subaru could tell from the look in her eyes and the state of her mind that she had been challenging the trial over and over, going at it again and again.
So
since
she
it was the
failed
only thing
multiple
she could
times?
do
She
to break out of the
didn't
grim
beat
situation
it?
that she found herself in. Her mind had been slowly and steadily worn down from the trauma that came with facing her past many times over. And I'm sure the constant failure didn't help either.
Okay,
So
yes,
it was a culmination of all these things that led to the Emilia that we see at the beginning. But as if things couldn't get worse for her, Subaru's reappearance did exactly that. His return spurred an overwhelming level of affection. Her words began to lose coherence as she tried to muster up what it was that she really wanted to say. At first, it was an apology for not being able to understand him. Then it was about how she'd changed herself so that she was thinking about him all the time. Finally leading into those last 3 words that Subaru had always wanted to hear. Words that I'm sure brought him more pain than any of us could even imagine. I mean, it's not like he didn't want to indulge in it. A part of him just wanted to accept Emilia's whispers of love and fall into its softness for the rest of this loop. But Subaru wasn't so self-conceited to believe that those words and her actions were genuine. So instead he left to confront the person who made her this way. The person who was controlling everything and everyone within Sanctuary. When the two first confronted Roswaal, the fact that Ram was there by his side indicated that she too was part of his schemes. Subaru didn't know what her true intent really was, but there was no denying that she took part in what happened to Sanctuary and Emilia. We're not sure if it correlates to her promise with Roswaal, but I do find it odd that Ram was smiling when she died. Although it was very subtle, she did have a slight smile on her face as she fell to the ground. Now, the reason why Garfield didn't just immediately turn into his tiger form was because of Ram as well. Garfield found himself at a crossroads. His rational mind was battling against his own survival instincts. Every part of his being was telling him to transform so that he could live, but his mind wouldn't allow him to do so. If he did, then the healing magic he was casting would stop and Ram would certainly die. So he didn't transform. Now, Roswaal didn't just know that Subaru could alter the past, but also that his power was a direct result of having made a pact with Satella. He just didn't say it in those exact words. There was also a bit more to their discussion of Beatrice. Before talking about her dearest wish, Roswaal first confirmed that she had in fact fulfilled her duty. Apparently, in between all that had happened, Beatrice had somehow completed her pact. At least, that's what Roswaal was implying. He didn't really get a chance to further explain though. Subaru had interrupted out of anger. He was furious that despite knowing the despair Beatrice felt, Roswaal still did nothing at all. But once again, that was nothing more than Subaru's arrogance talking. Unlike him, Roswaal actually understood that there was nothing he could do to relieve her 400 years of sadness. It's not like Subaru didn't already know this to be the case. It was just that this was something he couldn't seem to accept. As they moved on to the situation with Emilia, we find out that the snow was intended to turn both the villagers and Garfield against her. For a bit more context, this wouldn't have been the first time that they'd have dealt with an out-of-season snowstorm directly related to Emilia's presence. So it was that connection plus Garfield's immediate jump to suspect Emilia that allowed Roswaal to complete his goal. He used pre-existing prejudices to manipulate Emilia the exact way that he wanted to. And that was all with the intention of putting her into a position where she would have no choice but to depend on Subaru. If that was to happen, then Subaru's love for Emilia would render him unable to abandon her, securing Subaru as the asset that Roswaal needs in order to obtain his goal. The thing is, Subaru's current state made him unable to accept Emilia's feelings, so Roswaal's plan had essentially failed. Once he realized that, Plan B was to force Subaru to return by death. But Roswaal doesn't actually know the circumstances or specifics of Subaru's power, so instead he beats Subaru with the intention of forcing him to activate Return by Death himself, not being aware that death itself was the trigger. In fact, he actually felt that he could do everything except kill him. That was the key misunderstanding that Roswaal had on Subaru's power. He wasn't abusing him because he wanted to, he was just trying to get him to activate the next loop. When the rabbits appeared shortly after, we find out that the snow wasn't the only reason that they'd arrived one day early. Roswaal pointed out that demi-human blood is blessed with a significant amount of mana. So the fact that they were all now gathered into the cathedral likely made for a large clump of mana that looked like a very tasty meal for them. This wasn't where the episode ended though. The novel goes on to tell us how exactly it was that Subaru made it all the way to the tomb. The instant Roswaal died, Subaru made a dash straight to Emilia, passing by numerous houses as he could hear the screams of the residents being drowned out by the sounds of the rabbit. To ensure that he could get to his destination, Subaru called upon the remaining Ryuzu clones to intercept the rabbits, having them leap in and explode much in a similar way that Garfield did in the past. As he continued to run, there was one building that Subaru came across that made him stop right in his tracks. It was a massive building enveloped by fire. A building that Subaru could barely make out now as the cathedral. Over 100 people were supposed to be holed up in there. So why was it then that this building was now on fire? That's when Subaru finally understood. All those people in the cathedral chose to end their own lives in this flame. The villagers, the residents, Ryuzu, and even Otto all believed that this was a death easier to handle than getting eaten alive. And honestly, Subaru couldn't blame them. This was, after all, a hell of his own creation. And that's exactly what this was. A portrait of hell.
Goodness.
Now, as for the final scene, well, that was something that I'm sure needs no further explaining, bringing us now to the end of episode 36. So I hope you were able to make it to the end of this cut content. It was a little bit lengthier than normal, but definitely had some information worth sharing. So be sure to leave a like or comment if you enjoyed watching it. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank Guardian Tales once again for
God, goodness, man. I've never seen cut content from any news channel, but I'm glad I watched this because it gave me so much more insight on the episode after watching it. Because I watched all the seasons, I watched all the way up to that point, and just now knowing that and just seeing that, and I know it's a new episode that came out like yesterday or something like that I need to watch. But man, this is crazy, man. Like, if you guys have not seen ReZero, please watch this anime. It's crazy. It kind of doesn't make sense until you like really get into it. But it's 2 seasons in, up to episode 12 on the second season. It's crazy. But this is what exactly happens to Emilia Subaru's Hell Loop ReZero season 2, episode 11. Excuse me, cut content. But yeah, guys, so we're gonna end it off right there. This thing is pretty lengthy. It's 27 minutes. It's like one of my lengthier videos. But yeah, guys. So without further ado, guys, like I say, like, share, subscribe on the video if you're new. Subscribe to the channel. Also, as well, the bell notification, make sure you click all. Also, as well, follow my Twitch, follow my Twitter, and also as well, follow all the other channels in the description box down below, guys. And it's what you talk about. Peace.